Most people don't lack discipline. They lack a stable inner reference point. This paper explores why discipline fails for many people, despite the strong intentions and repeated effort they make. It argues that consistency is not primarily a function of willpower, motivation, or habit systems, but of having a stable internal reference point. Without this reference point, behavior becomes more reactive, emotionally driven, and fragile under pressure. A well lived life requires anchoring action to something deeper than your mood, urgency, or external validation. Discipline is often treated as a character trait. You either have it or you don't. People talk about building discipline the way they talk about building muscle: more repetitions, more pressure, and more intensity. But if discipline were simply about effort, then the people who care the most would be the most consistent. However, in reality, the opposite is often true. The people the people who think the most about improvement are often the ones who struggle the most to follow through. This suggests that the problem is not effort, it is orientation. So what is a reference point? Reference point. A reference point is the internal place from which decisions are made. It answers questions like, what does this action mean to me? Who am I acting as right now? And what am I protecting, building, or honoring? Most people do not consciously develop a reference point. Instead, they borrow one. They act based on how they feel today, what others expect of them, fear of falling behind, short term pressure, or urgency. These are unstable reference points. They will shift constantly. And when the reference point shifts, your behavior collapses because it's not reliable, it's not predictable, right? Motivation is emotional energy. Emotional energy fluctuates. When your motivation is high, action feels effortless. When it drops, everything feels heavy. People interpret this drop as a personal failure, an attempt to compensate by pushing harder. This creates a cycle. Your motivation rises, action follows, then your motivation fades. Thus, your self criticism begins and avoidance increases. This issue is not the drop in motivation. The issue is that nothing else is holding the behavior in place once motivation disappears. A stable life cannot be built on a variable fuel source, right? Discipline works when actions are tied to identity rather than outcomes. So that means when someone says, I need to do this so I don't fall behind, their discipline depends on fear. When someone says, I do this because this is how I live, their discipline depends on self concept. Fear based discipline burns hot and fast. Identity based discipline burns slow and steady. The difference is subtle but decisive. One asks, what happens if I don't do this? The other asks, who am I if I don't? And what is the cost of living without an anchor, a reference point? Without a stable inner reference point, people become reactive. They optimize for urgency over importance or priority, comfort over coherence, approval over alignment. So this leads to constant course correction. Plans are rewritten, systems are abandoned, goals change shape mid execution. And from the outside, it looks like inconsistency. From the inside, it feels like confusion and chaos, right? Over time, this erodes trust in oneself. And once self trust weakens, discipline becomes increasingly difficult to sustain. So, how do you build a stable inner reference point? A stable reference point is not a goal, it is a position. It is a quiet statement such as, this is the standard I return to. This is how I move through my day. This is the kind of person I am willing to be, even when it's inconvenient. This reference point does not need to be dramatic, it needs to be consistent. When action is anchored here, discipline stops feeling like a force. It starts feeling like alignment. So most people are not failing because they lack discipline necessarily. They are failing because their actions are not anchored to something stable. A well lived life is not necessarily about doing more, especially when you lack the capacity, the management, the structure, and the system, the tools to handle that workload. It is about acting from a place that does not shift every time your emotion or moods do. You know? So once a reference point is established, discipline becomes less about control and more about continuity. And continuity is what builds a life because you're progressing, you're ever growing, you're ever changing, right? But you still need a reference point that keeps you anchored. It feels sensible, it feels rational, and that makes it responsible too, I suppose.